All right, listen up. This is the Chief with some simple facts of life about climate change. Now, over the last several years, there's been a lot of talk about global warming, climate change, climate disruption, whatever they're calling it this week. And of course, it's all been caused by greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide pollution, some kind of human activity. Now, Al Gore tells us that the science is settled. The debate is over. And if you don't believe him, then you must be some kind of science denier. Now, I was going to explain all of this to my pet dinosaur until I remembered that I don't have a pet dinosaur, because millions of years before there were any humans on the planet, all the dinosaurs were killed by climate change. Now, some people will tell you that if you don't buy into their ideas, you must be a member of the Flat Earth Society or something. You know, my question is, for how many centuries was it settled science that the Earth was flat? You know, science is always discovering new things, so, you know, the term settled science is an oxymoron, because if it's settled, it's not really science. And if it's science, it's never really settled. But, you know, that just doesn't matter when there's money and power at stake. See, for over 1,000 years, the motions of the planets through the sky were explained by a scientific model where they moved around the Earth in epicycles. Now, sure, seems like it was kind of goofy, but the model did fit with the observed data, and if something wasn't quite right, well, they just made the model a little more complicated. You know, they would never admit that the model might be completely wrong, and that's because the religious powers that be at the time, they were very heavily invested in the idea that the Earth had to be at the center of God's creation. So, when Nicholas Copernicus came up with a new model that put the sun at the center of things, he knew how much trouble he'd be in. And that's why he made sure that his results were never published until after he was dead. Now, Galileo, he wasn't quite that savvy. When his observations seemed to confirm what Copernicus had come up with, he put that information out there. And the Inquisitors, you know, the Taliban religious police of the Renaissance era, they forced him to recant, you know, lest he be burned at the stake or something. So, what does this have to do with climate change? Now, while the current model may make sense to some younger people, I'm old enough to remember some things, and I know where this came from. See, I was a senior in high school on August 22nd, 1970, you know, the first Earth Day. You know, I grew up in Los Angeles, and I remember back then, when I was a little kid, the air was so polluted that some days I would sit in class in school and with my eyes would actually sting. And the air was so hazy, you sometimes couldn't see 100 yards. You know, back then, the scientists, they were convinced that all this air pollution was going to block the sunlight and bring on a new ice age. But I also remember the water pollution. I remember the crying Indian telling us how terrible we were at taking care of our world. But what happened? I'll tell you what happened. Some sensible laws and regulations were passed, And so nowadays when I visit Los Angeles, I mean, even though there's a lot more people around and a lot more cars on the road, the air is a whole lot cleaner than it was when I was a kid. And you know, our lakes and rivers, they've been pretty much cleaned up also. But you know, there's another thing going on back then. All the brilliant minds at the time were telling us that we were going to run out of oil. I mean, another 20, 30 years, we're going to burn every drop of oil that's in the ground. Well, I think we know better than that now. So it seems like we've solved a lot of our problems, and that's a good thing, right? Wrong. You see, what all this environmental concern did was, among other things, it spawned a whole new industry. You know, something that nowadays we call the green industry. And this is an industry that requires a whole lot of government regulations if they're going to survive and prosper. Because you see, they don't produce anything that you'd want to pay for if you had a choice in the matter. And since they're in the business of solving problems, they better have a problem to solve. And that's where this climate change scam came from. I mean, for them it's perfect. You have a problem that may or may not exist, and even if it does exist, you know they're not going to solve it because they don't want to. If they did, I guess they'd have to find a new problem to solve, or, God forbid, get an honest job. No, what they want to do is bribe the politicians into hiring a whole lot of bureaucrats to write more and more and more regulations that cause you to spend more and more and more of your money to pay for the useless junk that they're selling. So, you know, this climate change thing, scam, it doesn't have anything to do with the environment, or doesn't have anything to do with stopping the rise of the oceans, nothing to do with saving the polar bears. No, it has to do with one thing and one thing only, and that's taking more money out of your pocket and giving it to Al Gore and his rich friends. You know, and if you don't understand that, well, P.T. Barnum was reported to have said, there's a sucker born every minute. And if you buy into this climate change nonsense, well, I guess we know who that was the minute you were born. And that's the simple fact of life. Thanks for watching. Carry on.